Take a deep breath now, while you still can. Because the moment you step under the timber-framed archway of a 14th century meat market, your lungs are going to hit a wall of air so thick and putrid, you'll feel like you're inhaling solid matter. This isn't the sterile, refrigerated butcher shop, you know. This is a sensory slaughterhouse, with a stench of warm blood, unwashed animal hides, and the vinegary temps of rotting offal creates a microclimate that clings to your clothes and coats your throat in a greasy film. You're standing in the shambles. A street literally named after the open-air slaughtering benches, where the cobblestones disappear under a slurry of fat, intestinal fluids, and blackening blood that hasn't been washed away in weeks. In less than 10 minutes, the overwhelming humidity of decay and the buzzing cloud of millions of flies will have you gagging for a gasp of oxygen that simply doesn't exist here. The first thing that paralyzes your breathing isn't just the smell, it's the heat. Medieval meat markets were often built in narrow, overhanging streets, designed to keep the sun off the product. But this also trapped the air in a stagnant, windless tunnel. As you walk, your boots sink into the kennel, the central gutter of the street that serves as a slow-moving river of biological waste. There are no health inspectors here. Only the carnifex, the butchers who are hacking away at carcasses that have been hanging in the humid air since dawn. The copper-like smell of fresh blood hits you first, sharp and metallic, but is quickly overtaken by the sulfurous odor of guts being ripped open on the spot, because there is no refrigeration. The process of blowing meat where butchers blow air into carcasses to make them look plumper was common, meaning the very air you're trying to breathe is being recycled through the lungs of men working in the height of filth. You'll notice that the ground isn't just wet. It's slippery with a gelatinous layer of tallow and discarded suet. Every step releases a new pocket of trapped gases from the decomposing layers beneath the surface. Above you, the jettied upper floors of the houses nearly touch, creating a lid on this pressure cooker of bacteria. The sound is as suffocating as the smell, the rhythmic thud of cleavers hitting bone, the wet slap of meat onto wooden boards, and the constant, deafening hum of flies so dense they look like a shifting carpet on every surface. If you open your mouth to gasp for air, you risk inhaling these flies, which have just spent their morning on the awful heaps at the end of the alley. This is the reality of the medieval food chain, a place where the line between fresh and putrid is measured in hours, and the air carries the weight of every animal that has died there for the last 100 years. The social atmosphere of the market adds another layer of claustrophobia. You are jostled by servants, stray dogs fighting over scraps of gristle, and porters carrying heavy baskets of waste to the nearby river. Everyone is shouting, but the air is so heavy it feels like the sound is being muffled by a wet blanket. You see a butcher throwing a bucket of washed bloody water onto the street, splashing your shins and releasing a fresh cloud of ammonia-rich vapor. Your instinct is to cover your nose with your sleeve, but your clothes are already absorbing the ambient grease. You realize that for the people living and working here, this isn't a disaster zone. It's Tuesday. The cultural tolerance for this level of filth is perhaps the most shocking part. They don't breathe through their noses. And neither should you if you plan on staying conscious for another 60 seconds. By the 5-minute mark, your body begins a physiological revolt. The miasma, which medieval doctors believed was the actual cause of diseases, working its way into your sinuses. You're smelling the great rot. Because salt was expensive and preservation techniques like smoking took time, much of what you see on the hooks is in a state of high transition. The beef has a greenish iridescent sheen in the shadows, and the pork smells faintly of the garbage the pigs were fed on. Butchers often tried to hide the smell of turning meat by rubbing it with strong herbs or soaking it in sour wine, adding a confusing, herbal sickly sweetness to the air that makes the underlying rot even more nauseating. You aren't just smelling food. You're smelling the chemistry of death accelerated by a lack of basic hygiene. The legal reality of the market was a desperate attempt to control this chaos. Athelstane's law and various city ordinances forbade the sale of measly or corrupt meat, but enforcement was a game of cat and mouse. You might see an altaster or a flesh viewer inspecting a bench, but their standards are centuries away from yours. If a carcass looked okay and didn't move on its own, it was usually cleared for sale. The offal, the hearts, lungs, and entrails was often sold to the poorest residents right off the floor. As you watch a woman haggle over a pile of tripe that has been sitting in the sun for 4 hours, the realization of what people actually ate becomes a physical weight in your chest. The air is thick with the dust of dried bone meal and the dander of live animals waiting their turn in the back pens, creating a cocktail of allergens that makes every breath a struggle. Your vision starts to blur from the stinging ammonia. In the corner of the market, the tallow chandlers are likely rendering down the waste fat to make candles. The smell of boiling animal fat is heavy and cloying, a greasy smoke that coats the back of your tongue. This is the industrial side of the shambles. Nothing was wasted, but the cost of that efficiency was a total degradation of the environment. You see children playing in the red puddles, completely immune to the horror around them, while you are fighting a losing battle against your own gag reflex. The medieval market is a lesson in the brutality of the pre-modern world. It's a place that demands you harden your senses or leave immediately. There is no middle ground in the shambles, and the air will never let you forget that. As you reach the 10-minute limit, the biological reality of the market starts to feel like an assault. It's not just the smell anymore. It's the microscopic life you're inhaling. Every surface in the shambles is a breeding ground for Salmonella, E. coli, and various parasites that the medieval world simply called the flux. When a butcher wipes his blade on his apron, he's just spreading a layer of old bacteria onto fresh meat. You can feel a headache blooming behind your eyes as a result of the toxic levels of hydrogen sulfide rising from the gutters. Your breathing becomes shallow because deep breaths bring in too much of the heavy air, a thick, humid vapor that feels like it's filling your lungs with lead. The sheer volume of animals involved is staggering. A city like London or Paris in the 1300s consumed thousands of cattle, sheep, and pigs a week, and every single one of them passed through a space no wider than a modern driveway. You are standing in the throat of the city, where it swallows its protein and spits out its waste. The mucklocks who are supposed to clear the streets can't keep up, and the pile of garbage, a medieval term specifically for poultry, entrails at the end of the block is already several feet high. The heat from the decomposition in that pile creates its own upward draft, pulling more foul air toward you. Wow. You realize that a breath of fresh air is a luxury that doesn't exist within the city walls. You would have to walk for 2 miles to find air that doesn't taste like a tomb. At this point, your survival instinct is screaming. Your heart rate is up, not from fear, but from the lack of quality oxygen. The medieval meat market is a test of human endurance that we have forgotten how to pass. It represents a world where the proximity to death was an hourly occurrence, and the weight of the air was a physical reminder of the fragility of life. You see a beggar picking up a discarded sheep's head, and you realize that for him, this air smells like opportunity. Well, for you, it smells like a death sentence. The sensory gap between the 21st century and the 14th is never wider than it is right here, in the middle of a street that flows with blood and rings with the sound of the axe. Stepping out of the meat market and back into a slightly less foul street feels like emerging from underwater. Your first real breath of air, even if it still smells like wood smoke and horse manure, tastes like heaven. The shambles stays behind you, a dark, pulsing vein of the city that most people just accepted as the price of eating. We look at these old streets today, like the famous one in York, and we think they're quaint or charming with their leaning timber houses and narrow paths. But the stones remember the blood. They remember a time when you couldn't walk these paths without ruining your clothes and risking your health. The history of our food is a history of grime, and the medieval market was the front line of that war. It's crazy to think how much we've sanitized our world, isn't it? We get upset if a supermarket floor is a little sticky, but our ancestors lived in a world where the air itself was a biohazard. Maybe the way we handle plastic or the fumes from our cars will be their version of the medieval meat market. I'm always curious about how you guys imagine these things. Could you actually stand there for 10 minutes? Or would the smell of the tallow boiling alone send you running for the hills? I personally think the fly situation would be the breaking point for me long before the smell even hit its peak. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Does knowing the stinky side of history make it more interesting to you? Or do you prefer the Hollywood version with the clean streets and the perfect costumes? Drop a comment and tell me which part of this market sounded like the biggest nightmare to you. I read every single story you share, and honestly, your perspectives often end up shaping the deep dives we do here. If you're into this kind of no filter, look at the past, hit that subscribe button, and join our little community of history detectives. We're not just looking at dates and kings. We're trying to feel what it was actually like to be there. Thanks for sticking around through the grime. Today I'll see you in the next one. Hopefully somewhere that smells a bit better.